don't need my head to shine any brighter than it does. So by now you have discerned that last Monday was not only the Natalicio de Benito Juarez, but it was the feast of St. Patrick. And if you went up to the parochia, you might have noticed that there was a special dedicatory altar because Patrick is especially popular in Mexico because of the poorly treated battalion of Irish American soldiers who changed sides and joined Mexico's fight against the Americans in what the Americans call the Mexican-American War. And our men's group, as you have heard, has just returned from a retreat focusing on Celtic spirituality, and so today's Mass is a Celtic Mass. In an amazing coincidence, last Wednesday, an Irish soccer team boarded a train in London to return to Ireland, having beaten Manchester United in a remarkable match. And shortly after the team boarded, the coach stood up and addressed the entire train car. "We be having a spiritual emergency. Is there a Catholic priest aboard? Just raise your little hand." Well, no hands went up. Coach stepped down. A little while later, he stood up again and said, "We be having a spiritual emergency. Is there an Anglican priest aboard? Just raise your hand." No hands went up. But an American-looking fellow stood up and said, "I am a Baptist minister. And I know you are all of different denominations, but I can help in a spiritual emergency." And the coach stood up and said, "Aye, Pastor, I'm sure you're a good man in your ministrations, but we be in need of a corkscrew." Well, it's Lent. So confessions are being heard. I probably owe one to somebody after that. One of my early mentors at All Saints by the Sea in Montecito, California, which is now our companion parish, was a retired bishop named Daniel Corrigan, a wonderful guy, deeply devout. And he went regularly to hear the confessions of the Anglican nuns at St. Mary's Convent in Santa Barbara. And I was often his driver and his associate. And one day after such a visit, we got back into the car, and the bishop said, "You know, George, listening to nuns confess is a little like being stoned to death by popcorn." Well, Moses is leading his flock around trying to find some good grazeland when he notices an amazing thing, a burning bush. And Moses could have kept on herding the sheep forward, but he says, "I must turn aside to look at this great sight, a burning bush that is not consumed." And he turns aside and he approaches the bush. And it is only then, when the bush had Moses' full attention, that God spoke to Moses from out of the blaze. And he spoke to Moses of the deep suffering of people in Egypt, a place Moses knew well. As we walk the pilgrim path through our own lives, we will pass through pleasant vales and good grazeland, but also through the wilderness. And if we are alert, we may well witness strange fire. And if we turn aside and attend, God may well speak to us of the suffering of others. That suffering is addressed in our gospel lesson. The questions posed to Jesus might as well have been a reporter asking about the abandonment of Ukraine or the remaining hostages that Hamas has taken or the razing of Gaza. Luke's reporter asks about the slaughter of innocent Galileans and about those killed by a falling tower in Siloam. What's the explanation? They ask Jesus, who does not seem in the mood that day to act as God's defense attorney. So he answers pragmatically. Tragedy reminds us to align with the work of God in this moment, as though it were your last moment, because some moment in the future will be your last moment on earth. Perhaps you've read Rabbi Kushner's book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Rabbi Jesus seems, by comparison, curt. You're like a fig tree in a garden, and good fruit is expected of you. And now is the productive moment. There was a story on the news not long ago about 37-year-old Jeff Bush, who had been watching television in his bedroom outside of Tampa, Florida. At 11 p.m., as his brother Jeremy looked on from the next room, a sinkhole opened under Jeff's bedroom, entirely swallowing Jeff and the contents of his bedroom. And since I was watching the news on television at 11 o'clock, I got up and went to the kitchen for a glass of milk. And as I poured that milk, I found myself thinking that sometimes I feel like Jeremy Bush as he watched his brother Jeff swallowed up by the earth. I see terrible and inexplicable and undeserved things happening in the lives of many and of my parishioners, and I often feel useless in the moment. Suffering, our own and the world's, the suffering of others near to us, is a kind of a burning bush. We can graze on by, or we can turn aside and attend. And if we turn aside and attend, something will probably be asked of us. Come no closer, God says to Moses from the burning bush. You are on holy ground. To witness the suffering of others is terrain both holy and dangerous. We're not meant to try to enter the bush where we will be consumed. We are meant to attend, even at a necessary distance, and to hear what might be asked of us. And you can refuse to attend and just press forward looking for your own green pasture. Or you can rush into the fire and self-immolate. Neither of those is quite the right way to respond. To respond to suffering is to insist on a useful and fruitful life, and to listen for what that might mean. Moses heard a summons, and he responded, but not right away. And when he did, he didn't act alone. Aaron was at his right hand, and Miriam had his back, and support grew, and God was with him, and against improbable odds, the Egyptian oppressors were subverted. This parish doesn't have a specific social policy. There is an organization called the Episcopal Policy Network that sends me emails telling me to call my congressperson about this or that, and some of the things they want me to call about I agree with, and some of them I don't. The policy people are well-intended, but I think they are somewhat misfocused. The church isn't very good at nitty-gritty politics. On the other hand, when I witness a pogrom against diversity, equity, and inclusion, I am helpful for a man I recently heard say, the opposite of diversity is uniformity. The opposite of equity is inequity. And the opposite of inclusion is exclusion. And if you weigh your life in favor of uniformity, inequity, and exclusion, you have not been listening to the Scriptures. What the church does best is to attend to people and circumstance with a desire to prove fruitful. At its best, the church subverts pietism, the tendency to think that inward experience and a personal relationship with God is all that matters, and also subverts activism, the tendency to imagine that one's own conclusions about the governance of the body politic align perfectly with God's own. The pietist neglects the humanization of the social structures determining how real people live difficult lives, and the activist equates a particular vision of social change with the will of God. Holy ground is hard to navigate. Turn aside and attend, but maybe perhaps come no closer. Moses knows that God has laid claim to his energies, but he would like to be a little more certain about the one summoning him. What name do you have? Moses asked God. Under what banner shall I march? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Are you an Anglican? And God answers, Yeh asher yeh. He answers, I am who I am. As the Jewish theologian Martin Buber renders the phrase, God says, I will be there as one who will be there. And that is the only answer Moses gets, though he wants a little more. There is no satisfying answer when the towers of our lives fall. At Salome, the nation of Ukraine, when we witness a friend ravaged by a dreadful illness. A supposedly educated former professor assured me recently that the CIA was responsible for the Hamas attack on the Israeli Music Festival on October 7th, 2023. And I said something that might approximate, come no closer. Don't try to name what you don't understand. It's annoying, and it is perhaps even immolation in the fire. When illness comes to another, or a marriage falls apart, or a sinkhole opens under your brother's bedroom, there is no answer except to understand that God will be there as one who will be there through that which is unnavigable. Attend the fiery bush and see if you can hear what might be asked of you in a hopeless moment. But don't imagine that you'll have an answer for the reporter who wants to know why. St. Paul says today, in a passage taken out of context and often misapplied, No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. Well, that's good enough. But then Paul keeps talking. And he says, God will not let you be tested beyond your strength. And for certain, I have seen people in circumstances that pass the limits of the endurable. And I have heard this passage used as an indictment of those who just can't quite manage to stand up and dust themselves off after multiple blows. Paul's attempt at reassurance strikes me in this instance as ham-fisted. Moses has one more question for God. How do I really know that you will be with me? That's a question we'd all like to have answered as we stare into our personal sinkholes. And God says to Moses, here is the sign that I will give to you. After you have liberated the people, you and they will worship me together on the holy mountain. What a strange promise. Trust comes through exercising trust, and the result of trust is shared worship, or as we Anglicans put it, common prayer. And that's what Christ summons us to this day. Last week, we heard that Christ is like a tender, brooding hen who would gather us to herself. But today, Christ is sharp-edged. The suffering of others demands something of us. We can't graze on by, nor can we imagine ourselves to be the solution. We attend on holy ground. God wants us to bind up wounds and carry the burdens of others, but today Christ tells us there will be limits to our understanding of dreadful suffering and limits to the response that we can make, that we are summoned to attend and to listen carefully for what might be asked of us. Avoid easy answers and quick labels when there are no good answers, but understand that, like a fig tree, something will be required. So turn aside to the suffering that never burns itself out and attend. Don't let the suffering consume you. Know when to stop your approach. Yet know also that injustice lays claim to faith, and faith forges resolve, and resolve mitigates oppression. Once we have done what I am who I am has called us to do, then we will know that God is with us, because we will worship the God who will be there as the one who will be there. Amen.